Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Loretta J. Ross, lifelong human rights activist, professor at Smith College, 2024 inductee into the National Women's Hall of Fame, and 2022 recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship. In this episode, Loretta discusses the origins of her interest in human rights and human rights education, her work on realizing the potential of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, her advocacy of the rights of women, and her work to combat call-out culture and to combat white supremacy. So it's my great pleasure to be speaking today with, I would say, one of the most distinguished human rights defenders in the United States, Loretta Ross. Loretta is a recipient of MacArthur Grant in 2022, a professor at Smith College, and has been an activist and public intellectual for many, many years. How are you doing today, Loretta?
I'm doing fine for an older lady. I'm having a peaceful life, which is more than we can expect sometimes. Today is my late son's birthday, so I'm
sorry to hear that.
Celebrating the fact that I had 47 years with him and still doing the work that I think he would be proud of.
Well, that's great. Before we start, I just want to mention that today we also have, ironically, the first recognition in the state of New Jersey through legislation of Paul Robeson Day.
Really? Oh, that's going to be celebrated.
Yes, and it was just signed by Governor Murphy last week. And as a proud graduate of Rutgers, like Paul Robeson, I think it's long overdue.
Good. And I would just think President Trump is probably going to order y'all to rescind that.
And I hope that the governor tells them to go take a walk anyway.
Y'all have a great governor, so let's hope that.
So let's begin. Tell us about how you first became interested in human rights issues and subsequently in human rights education.
My first encounter with the phrase human rights was in 1970 in a Black feminist book called The Black Woman. But I was 16 years old at the time, didn't understand its significance. But I was very fortunate in the early 1990s to meet a woman named Shula Miss Koenig. And Shula, of course, was known as the mother of human rights education. She and I just happened to show up at the same conference in Iowa, and we were surrounded by a room full of men and three women, me, Shula, and Gay McDougal, who's very famous. And they were talking in very negative terms about the concept of human rights, because there's lack of justiciability, as they would say, and whether or not it could be used to force the United States into more human rights affirming behavior. They were quite despairing and cynical. And Shula took the lead in saying, well, people can't fight for rights they don't know they have. And she piqued my interest. And so that was my woke kind of acknowledgement of human rights. So even though I'd heard it many, many years before, Shula was the mother of human rights education, as the UN proclaimed, because everyone whose lives she touched learned about human rights education. But then its political significance for me happened in 1995, I believe. Again, don't quote me on years because I have such an uncertain memory as a senior citizen. But I was deprogramming a white supremacist named Floyd Cochran, because I used to work at the Center for Democratic Renewal National Anti-Klan Network that had been founded by Reverend C.T. Vivian. And Floyd once asked me, as we were doing his deprogramming work, where's the movement he can join? Because he had quit the Aryan nations, or actually been kicked out of the Aryan nations, and still wanted to do his effective work building movements because he was a movement man at heart. He just did it for the wrong people. I took Floyd's question to Reverend Vivian, and Reverend Vivian surprised me by telling me that Dr. King never meant to build a civil rights movement. He meant to build a human rights movement. And he went to his bookshelves and pulled down a copy of Dr. King's last Sunday sermon on March 31st, 1968. And in it, and I'm paraphrasing, Dr. King spoke of a triple revolution, a revolution in communications, a revolution in weaponry, but he said the most important revolution is the human rights revolution, a freedom explosion taking place around the world. So that's when it became my calling. Because everyone had told me Dr. King had a dream. Nobody told me he had a plan.
Mm-hmm.
And he was
So when you,
assassinated only 4 days later.
yeah,
So I always felt that I picked up the mantle of the twin legacies of Shulamith Koenig and Reverend C.T. Vivian, who sadly both died in the same year, a couple of years ago. And I've been not only founded the National Center for Human Rights Education to teach human rights to people in the United States, but really feel that I've been able to infuse human rights education into everything I've touched ever since then.
now the National Center, as you mentioned, is no longer formally existing, but tell us more about what its programs are like.
When we first started the National Center for Human Rights Education, and the we should probably include Shulamith Koenig, Reverend C.T. Vivian, and a fourth person, Abdullahi al-Nahim, who was a Muslim scholar. We had a strategic planning session because obviously if a small kitchen table operation wants to bring human rights home to the United States, where do you start? And in our strategic planning session, we felt that the audience of most consequence we should start with would be social justice activists who are already doing the work, but they weren't using the human rights framework in their work. And so that became our primary audience. That doesn't mean that we didn't deliver it to schools, colleges, churches, unions, wherever else that we could get an audience. But we've always felt that it was most important to convince social justice activists to not repeat the mistake of the civil rights movement and only fight for one category of human rights, but to fight for the whole panoply. And the only way they could do that, as Shula had pointed out previously, if they learned what the full set of human rights are and the mechanisms and treaties and things that enforce them. And so we spent a decade passing out 1 million copies of the UDHR. Everywhere we could find an audience. We had some school systems start celebrating December 10th, doing human rights audits of their cities, whether how well they complied with human rights. Started the whole concept of human rights cities, working with Shula so that cities could review their policies and practices to see if they were compliant with human rights standards and things like that. But that was a very exciting decade that I did that work in, and I'm very glad to have had that honor. Unfortunately, after I transitioned out, the succeeding executive director couldn't raise the funds to keep it going. And I should add, in defense of her, there's a peculiar habit within the Progressive Foundation movement for withdrawing funds from social justice organizations when there's a Democrat in the White House. They only seem to want to fund us when there's a Republican in the White House, because I think they want to prematurely declare white supremacy and human rights dead before it actually is. And so I don't want to say she was inadequate, but the context in which she had to do her work was inadequate. Bill Clinton was in the White House at the time I transitioned out.
Now, your own personal history in many ways deals with the struggle for equal rights, and particularly talking about the 14th Amendment. So, can you talk about your insights from your work in that regard and how they would be helpful to other people advocating for human rights?
Well, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution has a lot of stuff packed into it. First, the right to be a citizenship of the country in which you're born. So we got the right wing right now trying to revoke birthright citizenship guaranteed in the 14th Amendment. It also guaranteed equal protection of the law, which is, of course has never been fully enjoyed by anybody because right now we have different legal protections offered to the wealthy and powerful that the poor and disempowered don't have, for example. But still, it exists on paper. And we feel that there's a logic to why there's such an all out assault on the 14th Amendment, because interestingly, the Supreme Court has granted citizenship rights to corporations under the 14th Amendment while withdrawing the 14th Amendment protections from humans. For example, we argued that the protection of abortion rights is a 14th Amendment right because women who become pregnant should not lose their human rights simply because they're pregnant. That's denial of equal protection of the law, for example, or the way that immigrants who are citizens are applying for citizenships can be rounded up and deported is a violation of equal protection of the law. And to deny citizenship to children whose parents were undocumented, but the children who were born in the United States is a assault on the 14th Amendment. So it's very important for us to realize what strong and broad constitutional protections should be available under the 14th Amendment, but again, are only apparently extended to the rich and the powerful, read corporations, while individuals who should be getting that protection can see it's only provisional, depending on who's in power.
It's interesting you mentioned this bifurcation of who gets it and who doesn't, because right now the only thing that's, excuse me, that's providing education to undocumented residents of this country is a 5-4 decision based on the 14th Amendment, Plyler v. Doe.
Right.
And that decision, I'm sure, is going to be challenged by someone during the Trump administration. But you're right, it's very tenuous. People don't really understand how tenuous it is.
Well, that's why I believe in the superiority of the human rights, legal and economic and moral regime, because we live in a country that basically feels that what the Supreme Court giveth, the Supreme Court can taketh away, depending on the whims of who's in power. But our human rights are inalienable. They should not be only covered by legal fiat. They should be covered, they should be enduring simply because we're human, regardless of what country we live in, what our identities are, etc. And so when I learned about the capaciousness of the human rights framework, I was convinced that that's what we needed to be advocating for instead of constantly relying on the fickle nature of the Supreme Court.
Now, you've also created a separate organization dealing with rights for women, and that's called SisterSong. Tell us about the origins of that organization, its goals and activities, and what are some challenges you're facing today, particularly after the Dobbs decision?
Well, I was one of 16 women who co-founded SisterSong, but our original person who conceptualized us was named Luz Rodriguez, a Puerto Ricana from New York City. But I was fortunate to be one of the 16 women that Luce invited to co-found SisterSong. We were founded in 1997 because there was no organized collective that represented the perspectives of women of color when it came to reproductive politics. There was an assumption that the fight for reproductive politics was only about abortion and did not take into account all the issues that women of color were concerned about. So we defined for ourselves a concept called reproductive justice, which has three, now four basic tenets. We joined with the pro choice movement in fighting for the right not to have children using birth control, abortion, or abstinence. But our second tenet, the right to have the children that you want to have, was a particular need by women of color who were often subjected to immoral and sometimes illegal sterilization practices. And particularly as Black women who created reproductive justice, there was 12 of us who did that. We had, and myself, I was sterilized when I was 23. So I had a particular dog in the race to demand that it is a human right to have the children that you want to have and to have your birth plan respected, to have the uses of a midwife or a doula if requested, and to avoid an unnecessary cesarean section just because it was convenient for the doctor or the hospital to plan when your baby would arrive when it wasn't medically necessary. So that was the second tenet of reproductive justice. And then one critique women of color offered of both the pro-life and the pro-choice movement is that they seem to be less concerned about what happened once the baby was here. And so the third tenet is the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments. And that brings us into conversation with a lot of issues that aren't seen as affecting reproductive decision making, but they are. Because you need to have a safe school to send your child to and not worry about gun violence once your child gets to school. They need potable drinking water and a healthy food and a tax policy that doesn't make some schools rich while some schools are poor, a capable transportation system, yeah, environmental concerns, whether or not it's climate change and things. And so that's what makes reproductive justice so rich and so attractive to a lot of people who don't necessarily concern themselves with reproductive politics. They only think it's about abortion. But when you show them that the right to not have your children killed by gun violence or domestic violence is a reproductive justice issue too, it enlarges the movement of people who are concerned about these human rights issues who wouldn't enter through the portal of abortion politics. And then 10 years after the original reproductive justice framework was created, LGBT people demanded inclusion because they felt that their right to gender identity, the right to marry, the right to enjoy the same 14th Amendment benefits that non-gay people enjoy should be theirs too. And so they added the fourth pillar of reproductive justice, the right to bodily autonomy, gender identity, sexual pleasure, those kinds of things. What's I love about the SisterSong work and the expansiveness of the reproductive justice framework is its adaptability. Because when indigenous women use reproductive justice, they're always talking about sovereignty as well. When immigrant women use reproductive justice, they're talking about citizenship rights. When queer people use it, of course, they're talking about the alphabet soup of their issues. When men use it, they're talking about the right of men to participate in reproductive conversations. And Worry about chemicals that infuse the male body that can interfere with reproduction. So everybody can see themselves in the reproductive justice framework the same way they can see themselves in the human rights framework. But I often tell people reproductive justice is our portal, but human rights is our goal. Because you can enter the human rights movement by working on environmental justice or racial justice or queer justice or education justice, food justice, health justice. All these justice frameworks are portals through which you should arrive at the full protection of your human rights.
Well, what struck me when you were talking about the four tenets was how inclusive they are. Because one of the interesting things we find in the discussion about reproductive rights in a very polarized political situation in the United States is that it's all or nothing. It's all of one versus all of that. And to me, what you've said makes eminently much better sense to try to bring people together. Even if they can't accept everything, they can at least be part of it.
Well, that's a peculiar feature of SisterSong because we were co-founded by women who were both pro-life and pro-choice. And so staying together despite profound differences is in our DNA. We didn't have to start one way and then add the other and stir. They were already there in the pot cooking when we conceptualized how we would be with each other. And I think it serves as a model for how do you collaborate across differences that probably should be studied and lifted up more because people assume that our political divides are unsolvable. And I don't agree with that. My latest work, which we'll talk about later, is about calling people in across those differences. But SisterSong was a testament that you can work on reproductive politics, disagree on significant things, and still keep your seat at the table. Because not only abortion, but not everybody agreed that you should use a midwife. Not everybody agreed that you should go to a traditional hospital or stay out of a traditional hospital or have your husband present during the birth or whatever. Every individual gets to make that decision for themselves depending on what their context is. And no person can make a decision outside of their context. So if you're an undocumented woman needing prenatal care, but you're afraid to go to the clinic because you may get arrested and deported, then that's going to affect not only your reproductive decision, but the health and welfare of the mother and the baby.
Well, that's a nice segue into your teaching at Smith College. And very interesting in your book, and also what I've read about you, is your concern about call-out culture. And you also, of course, I think, address frontally white supremacy. So my interest here is not only from an educational perspective. I've been a teacher for almost 50 years myself. How have students in your classes responded to your efforts to deal with call-out culture?
Oh, I deal with call-out culture because of the students in my classes. No one is more vulnerable to the fear of having their incautious words torpedo their life like students, like young people, because they're at that age where their opinions on everything are evolving. And so they know the vulnerability of how one unfortunate tweet or post can show up when somebody's doing a background search on you for a job or a college application. So I didn't actually even notice the call out culture until my grandson brought it to my attention. And of course, he was at the right age to notice what was going on in the circumstances in which he was living. It was actually because he forced me to get on Facebook. I wasn't getting on Facebook. Then when I got on it, he said it was for old folks, so he was right. So anyway, that's where I noticed the call out culture. And so it is designed to help students understand that they've got to learn how to handle their passion with compassion. You can have radical politics, but you need to have radical love practices to go along with those politics. Use the knowledge that we're gifting you with responsibly. Don't weaponize words you just learned against somebody else for not knowing those words. Don't think that because you're convinced that you're right, that gives you permission to be rude. There's so many things that as older social justice and human rights activists that we failed to teach. We gave them brilliant analyses, but because we had not addressed our own internalized traumas around always having to look at the worst things human beings do to each other, because that's what you do as a human rights activist. You're always looking at the bad side of humanity sometimes. I don't think we understood the importance ourselves of how to make change without canceling people, which is my subtitle. How to agree to disagree on an issue, but still work together. How to not let the perfect become the enemy of the good, as President Obama said. And I wanted to tell vignettes from my life experience that taught me those lessons and then package them in a very accessible, non-academic way for anybody to have that conversation at a family reunion gathering or in a corporate board meeting. We can all have that conversation. But it was young people who were my most important audience when I wrote the book on calling in, because they know better than anybody who's a boomer like me how treacherous the waters they have to navigate their lives in. And I like their natural skepticism, though, because they're digital babies. Or somebody gave me a new term I just learned the other day called screen-agers. I had never heard that term before, but they grew up as screen-agers. And so they have a much more nuanced understanding of how they can be manipulated by the social media, but they're still vulnerable because they're still children in many ways. And so we have the radicalization of a lot of young men over the internet into very dangerous things, a lot of misogyny being seen as power when it's not. But we also have real human connections being made over the internet too. I teach an online course called Calling In, and my classes of about 150 to 200 people every night, when we have them, are global. People can call in and get connected from Australia to Spain and everywhere in between because of the reach of social media and the internet. So, like any other tool, it can do good and can be misused at the same time. But the audience of most consequence is young people, because we have to teach them the necessity and the power of hope in these very dangerous times and counter their impatience because they get frustrated that they're not in charge of the timeline. They wish all this stuff was over right now. So do we, after doing 50 years of it. But all we can do is keep doing the things that are right and not assume that we will be in charge of when the change will happen.
In other words, do what John Lewis said, make some good trouble and be patient in getting it done.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next program concludes our conversation with Loretta Ross, human rights activist and professor at Smith College. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, Overcast, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hins, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.